Imperial County. You'll find the Imperial County Community Air Monitoring Project, where you'll find the manual that we'll be referring to a lot during our presentation today. Next slide. And this just gives you an idea of some of the data that's on our portal. For example, here you're looking at a average fine particulate matter concentrations by county in California. Next. Okay, so just wanted to give you a little background on the Imperial County Community Air Monitoring Project. This was done down in Imperial County, down by the US-Mexico border, east of San Diego County. This was a 5-year project that we got funded by the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. The need for doing this type of monitoring was identified by community members. We put up a network of 40 particulate matter monitors, which are now reporting real-time information to the public on the internet. And we had a community engagement component, we had a research component, and a public health action component, which we'll be talking to you about later. And this was done as a partnership with the School of Public Health at University of Washington and our community partners, Comite Civico del Valle. And I'm glad to have my colleague, Christian Torres, talking to you, since he's had on the field experience with this network, and so can address questions about actually working with this network in the field. Next. So just an overview of what you'll learn today. Considerations for starting a community air monitoring project. How do you know if community air monitoring is right for you? How to tailor your approach to community needs, and the general processes for setting up a community air monitoring project, like establishing partnerships, some technical considerations and ways to communicate. And then we'll be showing you some examples from Imperial County on this. Next. And I mentioned the resources, so this, referring to this guidebook for developing community air monitoring network. Again, go to trackincalifornia.org, and right under projects, click on that, and you'll find all the resources around Imperial County that we've developed. And then also if you go to the California Air Resources Board website, you can find their community air protection blueprint. Next. So that's it for the intro, and now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague at Tracking California, Catalina. Kat?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm a health educator with Tracking California, and I'll be just providing an overview of community air monitoring and some of the steps involved in developing a community air monitoring network. Next slide. Next slide. So just as an example of why do air monitoring, we know that, for example, for particulate matter, they're many vulnerable to exposure to this kind of pollution, ranging from children, seniors, and those with pre-existing health conditions like diabetes and cardiovascular disease, lung disease. And then the effects of long-term exposure to this pollution are also, some are well studied, like the impact on lung function, respiratory illness, impacts on premature birth, and heart disease. But there's also newer studies coming around looking at the effects on mental illness and cognitive decline, and then of course more recently on a risk for COVID-19 and severe effects from infection for that. Next slide. So the way we define community air monitoring is, in our work, is it's an effort to collect air quality data that really centers community-based organization in the decision-making process, from setting the goals to selecting the sensor that will be used, where those monitors will be sited, and how this data will be collected and made available to stakeholders throughout the community. Next slide. And community air monitoring is really important because it can fill some important data gaps in terms of the information that regulatory agencies collect about air quality, which is more intended to paint a broad picture of generally what are, maybe a region or an area is exposed to, but they may not collect all the information that is important to a local community or get a better sense of what people are being exposed to on the ground. And then communities also have important resources to contribute to air monitoring data, their local knowledge and capacities and experiences, relationships and networks, and their engagement in advocacy and policy efforts to reduce exposure to pollution and improve air quality. Next slide. So as I mentioned, regulatory monitors can be limited in terms of the kinds of information they can collect. They're of course essential to protecting health and air quality, but community air monitoring can help really fill some of those gaps. So on the left, you'll see an example of an air monitoring station. On the right, there's several examples of air sensors and monitors that can be used in community air monitoring projects. And the lower left is, the lower right is an example of one of the boxes that for the monitors that have been used in Imperial County for the air monitoring project that Paul mentioned. Next slide. So today we're really going to focus on establishing a long-term kind of set of or network of community air sensors in a particular area, which is here on the lower right. And there's of course many different kinds of community air monitoring that can be very valuable, but that's the kind that we're going to focus on today. Next slide. So there are many different considerations in terms of selecting which community air monitoring project is right for you, what air quality issues are of concern in the community, whether sensors exist to collect information on that kind of pollution that are affordable and available. If there is a community partner that can lead this effort to collect this information, and if there are clear uses and users for this information. And lastly, really important in terms of a network, which is a long-term investment in the infrastructure to conduct this monitoring in a particular area, is there a long-term need for this data and a community group that can commit to helping to maintain that infrastructure. Next slide. So this is a polling question we wanted to ask as we transition to the next section, and then we'll show the results. So if you could take a moment to fill out your response. The next slide. We'll close out the poll, and in the meantime, I'll just start sharing some information around just an overview of next steps for developing a community air monitoring project. Next slide. So community air monitoring data can be used for a variety of purposes, for research, for documenting air quality trends in a community, informing policy and program work, as well as community outreach, education, and advocacy. It can provide real-time information and via alerts to community members when air quality is poor to help protect health. But it cannot be directly used for regulatory action, though it can be applied to advocacy efforts, and Christian will talk more about that later today. Next slide. So there are a number of steps involved in setting up a community air monitoring project. One is to develop a plan where you set goals for what you want to achieve with collecting the air quality data. You identify partners in your team and how you plan to engage the impacted community. The next step is to really choose a monitor, assess your options, what kinds of sensors are available, are affordable in terms of low-cost sensors for the particular kinds of pollutants you want to monitor. The next step is really to ensure or set a process in place for ensuring data quality, which we'll talk more about later. And then setting up the monitors. So you have to figure out where to site the monitors, how to recruit hosts who will allow you access to installing those monitors in those locations, and then deploying the monitors. And lastly, sharing and using the data. So how are you going to communicate this information to key stakeholders, collect and analyze it, applying this data to action, and ensuring long-term sustainability of the network. Next slide. So just to define your goals, next slide, there are a few things to consider. So one is balancing the values of robust community engagement with those of ensuring that the data that the network is generating will be scientifically valid, accurate, accessible, transparent, reliable. And so really at the heart of this is making sure that the community partners really engaged in decision making around how broad community engagement happens, what capacity building looks like throughout the process, so that they can take that more incremental steps towards maintaining the network over time. Next slide. So the example will be, this is all based on and we'll be talking throughout about is the Imperial County example. So just to give you a sense of how those considerations were applied in this context of the air network there, the Comite was really involved in the entire process from start to finish. It was intended to be a long-term network that measures, focuses on measuring outdoor particulate matter across the county to provide real-time data to reduce exposures in impacted communities, and collects data continuously and shares it on a website that Comite manages, the Ivan-Air website. And the public is a direct user of the data that is provided in real time on that website. Next slide. So these are a few questions that can help your team define your goals and choose your approach. So what you want the air monitoring data to tell you, what you want to do with it, and what you want others to do with it, as well as what type of project would help you to collect this data, and what resources, capacities, technologies are available to meet your goals. Next slide. So in terms of considering who else may use this data, it for how they would get the data, and then what kind of data quality would be needed for those uses, intended uses. So these are some examples of specific kinds of end users that you may want to consider. Next slide. And in terms of having a vision for your project, it's really helpful to think through how involved you want the community to be, what other stakeholders you want to engage in the project, how much flexibility you have in terms of time frame, resources for carrying it out, which monitors you intend to use based on those needs and goals, how much, what level of data quality you need, given the end users that you, and end uses that you would like, and where you want to put the monitors and communicate the data. Next slide. To talk a little bit more about establishing the partnerships for your project, next slide. There are a few different skill sets that are really valuable to have on your project team. So of course, the aspects of assembling, maintaining your monitors, developing any kind of web interface needed to provide that data to your end users. There's also an important role in terms of project coordination, just planning and facilitating meetings, moving forward project activities, and setting up partnership agreements that lay out clear roles and responsibilities among team members. There's also the science and research component in terms of what you, how you would manage the data, what kinds of analyses you might run with it, and how that might inform any air quality science and technology that you're interested in engaging with in your project. And then last but not least, outreach and education. So how are you gonna, people who are, can really lead thinking through how to engage the various community stakeholders you wanna engage in your project and communicate and disseminate your data. Next slide. So the project team can be, they can be the core organizations involved in your project, or you can subcontract parts of it, obviously, to other people or groups. You could involve, of course, community partner organizations, which is really essential for a community air monitoring project, as well as non-governmental organizations, as technical partners, government agencies and universities, and sometimes private companies as well, like air sensor companies, and can be involved. Next slide. So to build effective and equitable partnerships, there are a number of different components of this, but really it's to develop a structure for collaboration with all the partners in your project to carry it out and to plan it together. So that includes clear communication processes, how you will allocate adequate funding and resources given the kinds of roles you want each partner to play in the project. These partner agreements I mentioned are really helpful as tools to be clear about who and how decision-making will be carried out, and how the work you're planning to do together, who's in charge of what. And then just checking in regularly with your project team, which is something, project coordination, essential component of that entails. Next slide. So in terms of engaging broader community members and other stakeholders in your project, next slide. Community steering committees are really valuable, or other kinds of community advisory groups to develop as part of your project. They can involve all kinds of different community members and leaders from different community-based organizations, and places where you may intend to site monitors that may be disproportionately affected by the kinds of pollution you're measuring in the community. So it's important to also lay out clear roles and responsibilities for members of the community steering committee to figure out how they will be involved in decision-making and activities to carry out the project, as well as evaluate its impacts and progress. Next slide. A technical advisory group can be also really helpful to help guide some of the more technical aspects of the project, even though they're not a decision-making body. And this is how you can engage government, universities, the private sector, specialists in the work, and support ongoing relationship building communications with these stakeholders. Next slide. And then it's important to also consider, who and how else you could engage other stakeholders that may be interested in your project. So these are some questions to consider, and that can include things like, other groups like schools, the media, other kinds of community institutions that might be interested in the work that you're doing. So it's great to cast a wide net and to make sure you structure in other opportunities for broader engagement in your project from the impacted communities and institutions and agencies based in that area. So next I'll hand it over to my colleague David, but before I do so, we do have one polling question. And so in the meantime, if you could fill out the second question response as we transition, and then we'll show the responses. Thanks very much, David.
Thanks, Kat. Good morning, everybody. My name is David Chang, and I'm a project coordinator with Trekking California. I also help out with education and outreach on the team and helping with a lot of different air monitoring projects that we have with community partners. So maybe take another 10 seconds or so to complete the poll question, and then I'll jump into some technical considerations for air monitoring. All right. All right, so I'm going to be talking about choosing an air monitor. So for today, we're thinking about some definitions. So there's a difference between a sensor and a monitor. A sensor are the components that measure different air pollutants. A lot of times it's sold on its own or as part of a monitor. A monitor can contain multiple sensors. It contains everything needed to collect and transmit data. It can include additional sensors around temperature that are measuring temperature and humidity, and it can be custom built or purchased or ready-made. So I'll be getting into that a little bit later. But for the definition of what we're going to be talking about today is community air monitors. When we're talking about community air monitors, we're referring to ones that are low cost, that have low cost sensors in them. So usually that's in a price range of around $200 to around $500. So we're not thinking about the really, really expensive air monitors that you might find elsewhere. So these are some examples of ready-made monitors. A lot of times you'll hear them being referred to as off-the-shelf, something that you can find on Amazon, or plug and play. A lot of times these monitors have data visualization components that are already connected to them either via an app or a website. So these are some examples of ready-made monitors. You'll find a lot of times they'll be used for indoors. They can measure outdoor pollutants. A lot of times they're very portable as well. So these are just some examples. And this is an example of the particulate matter monitor being used in the IBAN network. So you can see that it's really custom built to meet the needs of Comite, right? So it has a cooling fan and a heater. It has a sensor that measures particulate matter. It has like a small computer where data is being stored. It measures temperature, humidity sensors. There's also an enclosure to keep it safe and free from obstruction from like dust and other things that might interfere with the monitor and the sensors that are inside. So when thinking about which monitor you want to use, it's really going to depend on the pollutants that you're trying to measure. Going back to what Catalina was talking about earlier about your project goals. So thinking about, is this monitor going to be providing data that is being used to supplement government data, or is the data really using this as an educational tool for maybe younger audience, are using it in schools? It's really going to depend on what your project goals are. It's also going to depend on the data collection method and the financial and technical resources that are available to you, right? Are you going to be looking for a monitor that's really expensive or one that's more low cost and more available to you depending on the budget that you have, right? So we're going to go into our third polling question. Maybe take a minute to answer. All right, I'm going to go ahead and stop the poll. Thanks, everyone. So I think most people put, how do you know which monitor is right for you? This depends on all but the following: how easy it is to maintain. Thanks. And then we're going to go into talking about data quality. So ensuring data quality, and what does that mean? So why do we care about data quality, right? Again, the underlying message here is data quality should really match your project goals and data needs. As I mentioned earlier, if you're not going to be using it to compare to, if you're not going to have that data be usable for government or for researchers or for technology developers, maybe you're trying to teach to a different audience, that might not be as important, right? But you want to have really good quality data to have to inform the community about the pollutants that are in the area. You want to make sure that the quality is high if actions are going to be taken, and you want to increase credibility for the organization and the data that is being collected. So these are 4 different things that can impact data quality. 1 is the quality of the sensor and the monitor. 2 is calibration. 3 is quality control, and 4 is monitor maintenance. So questions to ask when selecting a sensor or monitor: how well does it estimate pollution levels? How accurate is it? How consistent is it? What levels can be detected? Is it low versus high? You want to make sure you know about the monitor that you're choosing, how it's been tested. Has it been tested out in the field or just in the lab? Does it match with the conditions that you're actually going to be monitoring in your community? And is it only being tested by the manufacturer, or is it being tested by university researchers? A good place to look is on a website called AQ Spec. It has a list of different monitors and where they have been tested, out in the field versus in the lab. The California Air Resources Board and EPA both have a number of different resources on monitors and their differences as well. So these are some good places to look and get started. What is calibration? So no monitor is completely accurate. Calibration helps improve accuracy. And what we're doing is you're applying a math equation to the monitor to improve the accuracy. Usually it's developed by comparing your monitor's results to a high-end monitor. So a lot of times that means putting a monitor close to a reference monitor and comparing the 2 monitors and how they're performing based on the pollutants that are being, and the data that's being captured. So the equation should also include other factors that impact monitor readings, such as the temperature, humidity, and other pollutants. And again, you should think about your project goals when it comes to the data quality, whether you're going to be using that, whether the quality needs to be really high or lower. What is quality and control? So quality control is removing bad data to prevent inaccurate results. So essentially cleaning up the data set that is coming in. When does it happen? It happens both in real time, but also during the duration of the project that you're going to be implementing, as you're working later on with different data sets and looking at historical data and different trends. It can include moving measurements known to be incorrect, addressing incomplete measurements, alerting when a monitor is not functioning well or is offline. Who might do this? It could be the manufacturer if you're using one that's ready-made, but it can also be people that are on your project team, such as consultants or technical advisors that are really looking at the data more closely. There's a lot of things that can impact your monitor's performance. So in Imperial, there was a lot of really hot days during the summer. Sometimes there were bugs and critters that could crawl into the monitor box, a loss of internet. At nighttime, it could be really cold. As mentioned earlier, there's a lot of dust and sandstorms that could happen, a loss of power. A monitor can age over time and it'll perform it won't be as reliable as it was before. So you want to think about drift, and you also want to think about theft and vandalism. And you want to make sure that you're maintaining the monitor on a regular schedule. So implementing a monitor maintenance plan is really important as well. So as I mentioned earlier, data quality assurance and control is an ongoing process, and it should happen throughout the length of your project. And it can be improved as more opportunities and resources become more available. So what are some other things that you should be considering when selecting a monitor? The storage, is it going to be backed up onto an SD card? Is it going to be uploaded to a server? Are you going to have access to the raw data free of cost, or are you going to have to go back to the manufacturer and ask for it? How is it being made available? Is it going to be very easy to understand by the community if you're implementing it? If your goal is to share information with the community, how are they going to understand that information? You want to think about the visualization of the data as well. So take here's our fourth poll. Maybe take a couple seconds to fill this out. Okay. Thanks, everyone. So yeah, how often should you perform data quality and assurance? It's really going to depend. As I mentioned before, it's an ongoing process that you should think about, from the very beginning to the very end of your project. The last thing I'm going to talk about before I hand it over to Christian is the location of a monitor. The location of a monitor should be really meaningful to the community. You should think about your project goals. Is it going to increase community awareness? Is the data more likely going to be used? Is the data more likely going to be impactful for the community? You really want to consider inputs from the community when thinking about locations, because they have a lot of on-the-ground knowledge of the pollutants that are the different sources of pollutions in the area, but also what they want to try and measure and what's really important to them. This is just an example of a process to think about siting. So you want to define the area that you're monitoring. Are you thinking about a large region? Are you thinking about a particular community? Do you want to space out your monitors in even distribution? Then you want to identify co-location sites. So this goes back to making sure that you have really good data quality. Comparing your monitor to a reference monitor and putting up a monitor next to a co-location in an area for a long period of time. You want to think about recruitment for community residents and how they're going to be involved in the process. And you want to assess what's really important to them. So are you thinking about using the data to inform, for example, a school flag program? Where are people gathering in the area? A lot of times they have a lot of input on where to place the monitors. And you want to also number 5, you want to select final and alternate locations. You want to be able to have backup locations in case the initial sites that you selected don't work out. What is the role of a monitor host? So a monitor host is somebody else in the community. It could be a community steering committee member, but it could also be somebody else. This person provides a secure location to you, supplies the monitor with power and internet, allows access and for installation and maintenance, and alerts you to any concerns or changes. So it could be a school site, it could be a residence, it could be. Before using a monitor, you want to make sure you schedule a visit with the monitor host or go on a trial run. You want to make sure you have a formal agreement for where to install the monitor and let them know that you're going to be coming every 3 or 4 months to check on the monitor. You want to make sure that you have the proper tools and materials that you need, and you want to test out the monitor before you go out and install it and make sure everything's working. What might installing a fixed monitor entail? Sometimes you'll need a tripod or a place to mount the monitor. You want to make sure you connect it to the power and network cables. Make sure that you test the monitor after you've set it up. And you want to document the installation process, all the equipment that you used. Make sure you have, if you're setting up multiple monitors, make sure you know the number of monitors. Just make sure that you document the process. And lastly, if you're going to be using a portable monitor, a lot of times you'll need to calibrate it or zero it before you go ahead and start it. You want to go out multiple times to obtain some baseline information. Make sure that it's connected. A lot of times these portable monitors need to be connected to an Android device or a GPS unit So make sure that you have all the connections squared away before you get started. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Christian, who's going to be talking about communicating and using an air monitor, monitoring data for action.
All right, good morning, everybody. Next slide, David. All right, so what we use for the Imperial project, for example, is real-time air quality data. Monitors upload data every 5 minutes for 2 to 4 different sizes for particulate matter. And what these monitors can be used for is to increase awareness in the community, air quality knowledge, and engage the community. We've seen members that participated in this project, the members of the community, kind of pick up all this new useful knowledge and become more participatory in civic engagement. They serve on committees, public health campaigns, and the like here in Imperial. We've also seen it happen throughout California when they've been exposed to the project. The data we use also informs the school flag program based on the EPA program. Here in Imperial, we have over 20 schools participating, with half of them already being air monitor hosts or having a monitor about across the street or a block away. And could also trigger additional monitoring. The advantage of us having the Imperial project in our region is that we were first in line to be considered for one of the AB 617 communities in California, which allowed us to be selected for community monitoring plus emissions reductions planning, which we're implementing over this year and next year. A consideration to take when you're developing a community or monitoring network is how to make it knowledgeable to the community that you have one in place. We've seen that you may need to be at every public event providing either a flyer or some presentation regarding it. We've made it easy where we've kind of developed a one sheet. We've developed small flyers. We've given people presentations, and we've also made a mobile app. We made the website mobile friendly, and we've made everything kind of simple and translated all the material because we do serve a large Latino population that sometimes is monolingual and needs to be able to decipher the information in Spanish. Next slide, David. There's also uses for historical air quality data. These can help, and what this means is data collected over time. In Imperial, for instance, we have 5 regulatory stations that have been here before the community network was installed. Now the community network has at least 4 years worth of data and a lot of these locations, which are being used to help local actions as well as inform policy and advocacy in the state of California for our region. The use for historical air quality can be to find trends and hotspots as they measure ambient air quality. In our scenario, we do live in a border region, so we border Mexico, the north end of Mexico, where regulation is a little more lax than it is in the US, and they still have a high use for manufacturing as well as agricultural burning and customs, cultural customs where they burn trash and other materials. Next slide, David. The goals for how your data should be communicated kind of outline how you should design your project. For instance, in Imperial, the use was to be for the community. As these are not regulatory monitors, the data was going to be used to inform and help people take action in how to reduce their exposure. You have to provide interpretation to give results meaning. In our scenario, we can't give raw data out and the public data display to the community because they will not understand what it means, and even some of the results. So we created a data display base called the community air quality levels, and interpreting that data now gives them a reason to a way to reduce exposure, and then that's based on the air quality index. And you have to also be able to communicate the limitations to your data. The community air monitoring data is not regulatory data, but what we can say it is complementary to regulatory data because we can provide more coverage and localized data for areas that may suffer hotspots that are not being caught by regulatory monitoring. And yeah, okay, next slide. So like I said, these are some examples from the Imperial project. So who informed how we were gonna use the data? The community residents or a steering committee formed a community residents, and that data was for real-time particulate matter for PM 2.5 and PM 10. What they wanted to know is how safe the air was. We do suffer from disproportionate cases of asthma in children and in older adults. And what they wanted to know is what they could do, what actions they could take to protect their health and reduce exposure to bad air quality. Now, we had to take into consideration what air quality measures and what we can measure with our low-cost sensors. How can we interpret that data and make it meaningful for them to be able to use it? And was this going to be consistent with the government messaging? Local politics here played a part in the way some of these things were, as they were part of the technical advisory committee. But they also helped kind of inform the messaging that the steering committee was giving on how our data displays are going to be developed. Next slide, David. And here you see the example from our project. This is the community air quality levels. As you can see, it correlates with the AQI, but this is more community-friendly messaging. And we did limit it to the 4 colors instead of going on the bigger scale, as we do see that there is already risk when we're approaching these levels. Next slide, David. And these are some of the uses that we've had for the data regarding the Imperial project. We have been able to provide social media posts. We've been able to do localized events on Facebook Live and other live streaming platforms. We have a website where we display these monitoring results. It's real time, so every 5 minutes the air quality gets updated. You can sign up for air quality alerts through either the app or the website. So you can sign up for monitors near you or near your kid's school or near a public area where you want to know how air quality is. You can also provide reports based on the air quality data. We've had a lot of media coverage for our project locally and across the border from us as one of the biggest networks, providing such a public service. There are data sets for our quality data, which you can request through our website. We've had data requests from researchers that are working in the region, because we do lie in a unique scenario where we have an environmental problem to the north of us and the Salton Sea drying out, and the international border, which we can't really affect with as a community organization without the help of the government. And it's also helped us promote a lot of meeting and events. We do host an annual Environmental Health Leadership Summit, which ties in a lot of the project that we do. Next slide, David. And this is polling question number 5. Real-time air quality data can be used for all of the following. But you're going to give it around 20 more seconds, David. Okay. Next slide. And this is a consideration that you take when you come up with the project on how to display the data on the web. One of the first questions you get asked is who's going to operate the website and where and how the data is going to be displayed. In the Imperial project, the website is operated and owned by CCV. Tracking California is still a partner in the project, and they do assist with the QA/QC process. And if you're not operating the website, you have to have as a community partner or whoever is running the project. On data display, interpretation, and messaging, you've seen examples of air quality sensor companies come and go, which means that the data is collected and then gone. And that leads to how dependable your website operator is. So can they ensure that the data is going to be public and that is going to live even if they have some financial difficulties, or they have to be acquired, or they close down? What will happen if it's discontinued? And do you have the capacity to take it over and continue working on your project and keep these monitors online as well? Next slide. And this is an example of the IVA network. for the initial 40 sensors that were placed in Imperial County. This is an example of the community air quality level that was located at a school, the URL to the website, and the data display here to your right, which you can see in with the health recommendation, as well as the community air quality level listed as a number. Next slide, David. Okay, and the consideration is there are many ways to communicate and display data. Some may want the alert, some may want the color scheme. So you have to find out what is better for your constituents that you're going to use, and what measures you're going to use to collect this data. Is it going to add any useful information, or are you just repeating the process the government or your air district is trying to do locally, if they are working on this? What is the use for the data for the people? Is it to reduce exposure? Is it to try to find an issue? Is it to inform advocacy efforts? Is your data going to be easy to interpret? Can you have a takeaway from the information without having to conduct a lot of formal analysis if you are a community group, if you are working with community, if you're partnering with academia, that there is some bridge that you can do there. You want to test your data displays in your data dissemination plan with your primary audience. We did that with our steering committee, and they're the ones that informed the changes that needed to happen to the data displays. And you have to be able to plan for future enhancements. In our case, we are working with and developing new low-cost monitors that are going to display different types of data. And we're also working on updating the data displays to make it more advanced and provide features that a lot of other sensor companies are interpreting now. Next slide, David. Yeah, and here you can see a lot of pictures from different projects. The Imperial project is at the bottom. You can see West Oakland's partner project with Acclima and Google on the top left, and some other projects, community projects. So, I mean, the biggest takeaway here is that you want to develop partnerships in your projects. You want to build capacity across the board with all the different project teams, and your partnerships should have a focus on building long-term relationships. We've been working with Tracking California for, I think, close to 20 years, Paul, or something like that, that Luisa's worked with you. So we can see that the partnerships are fruitful and that they're very positive. Next slide, Ed. Okay, then this is where Calvin's gonna start taking over.
Hi, thank you so much, Christian. I thought the presentations were extremely interesting, and I've been following in the chat where we have a number of good questions. And if it's all right, I'll pose them to each of our panelists, starting with Paul, and then you can tee it off to someone else if you'd like. Our first question was about community members' education on data provenance and maybe metadata. Not only do you have to collect data, you have to know its quality and you have to preserve its quality and ensure that it's not changed. How do you communicate that with community members and how do you make sure that those quality assurances are put in place?
Yeah, and we have a chapter on that in our community air monitoring manual. And Calvin, I know there was this, I don't know if this is, are you rephrasing? I think there was a couple questions around quality assurance. We do have a protocol. We'd be glad to share that. It's not like a formal QAPP plan or quality assurance plan that had to be approved. But we do have, flow charts and procedures and code. We'd be glad to share with how we do the quality assurance. And I think also, Calvin, there was a related question around timestamps and location and logging. And Christian, would you mind mentioning briefly about how important that is with the timestamps and locations and recording all that in a log and in the data and how that, yes?
Yeah, and I can see the question here that came in. So as it comes to attaching any locations, timestamps, dates, we do use a mobile app, ODK, which logs everything instantly when we're out in the field. That keeps everything. We also attach pictures and GPS coordinates so to keep the location and the conditions. It's already timestamped at the moment that you kind of fill out the form and upload it. Field techs are kind of trained to do that the moment they're up there. so that we can have these as best results. And these are shared with the team that does QA/QC, so that they can see what the conditions were when they're manually reviewing the data.
Thanks. That's really great. I also saw a really good question about outreach, specifically maybe people who don't have internet access, or what kinds of changes have there been to your outreach amidst social distancing and some of our stay-at-home protocols?
Right now, we've transitioned most of our outreach campaigns to either telephone, because we do have a bustling asthma program that works with the community hand in hand, and we used to provide home visitations, but now they're more phone sessions. We've also transitioned to people who do have internet and have the time and want to entertain their kids or themselves. We do provide live streams online on Facebook or to our Facebook page, where we're trying to do campaigns and help them and recreate our in-person presentations on our projects and provide some sort of game so that they can follow along and interact with us.
Yeah, I think that's really cool. A lot of times we present sensor data in a scientific conference format, but a good Facebook live stream is a great way to meet people where they are. Does the project have any experience with personal sensors, or maybe a mix of stationary, mobile, and personal sensors?
No, we don't. We're not using any personal sensors in this project. There are other programs, like, for example, Acclima is a group that's partnered with Google and has, they have mobile data where they drive around the streets, and they've paired that with some stationary data and some personal monitoring. So yeah, we're just using these stationary monitors in this project.
Great. We also had a question about co-location. For instance, how long might you want to co-locate a sensor at least in order to feel confident in the performance of the sensor?
Yeah, the key with co-location is you want to have it during a time where you're going to see a range of the levels. So you want to a range of levels that you would see in the real world. So you want to have it in a location long enough that you'll see the levels at a low level, so the best times, and then the most polluted times, so you can get a range of particulate matter, in this case exposures. We also, once we did the calibration, we also did something, and it's all described in an article that we had published on calibration by our colleague Graham Colvin, who did the work out of University of Washington. And we also did something called validation. So once we had the algorithm from the calibration, we got some mobile reference monitors, and we went to different sites within Imperial County, and we applied that equation to our experimental monitors and compared it to these mobile reference monitors to validate and see if we had to do any more fine tuning of the calibration equation.
Yeah, part of that equation might be relative humidity. Can you talk maybe a little bit about how humidity might affect these sensors, and maybe how each and every region you deploy a sensor in could be different?
Yeah, so a particulate matter, the properties of particulate matter are affected by humidity and temperature. And so if you're trying to get accurate readings, this is a light scattering particle counter that we're using. So if you want to get, and these counts have to be converted into mass, and that's why another reason we do the calibration equation is to get that equation to convert the counts into mass. And so those chemical properties of the particles are affected by temperature and humidity. And so that's why you should, if you're doing something similar, you should be measuring those at the same time you're doing your calibration, so you can adjust for those factors in the calibration equation.
Great. Another good question kind of on the sensor itself and its use was, how did you protect from vandalism? That was one of the key considerations for deploying.
Well, I mean, I'll have Christian maybe add a little bit to this, but I think that wasn't a big issue. I mean, Imperial County is more of a rural area, and a lot of these monitors we mounted on top of buildings that really aren't accessible or even visible. I think this would be totally different if you did this in an urban setting where this is going to be more difficult. I don't know. Have you even had any issues with that, Christian? Go ahead.
We've had one that we saw that one of the hinges was abused, and we've had one monitor, the enclosure, be tampered with. So they did break it, but it looks like that was a one-time issue where the property owner left the property and it just, we weren't informed of that. Yeah, he was an older gentleman that forgot to inform us, but it's not really an issue, as you said, Paul, because they're located so high or in areas where you require a specific key to get to or someone to let you in. The vandalism hasn't really been an issue with us.
That's great. Possibly related to that, there was a question about the agreement you might make with a host for the sensor. Specifically, did you create a sort of model or template agreement that would be shared with each prospective host?
You guys have those, don't you, Christian? Written
Yeah,
agreements
there are two versions of the agreement right now. There's one that we were given by one of the agencies we co-located with, which we're still co-located with, which is a public utility company with us. And the other one is a template that we use for every other monitor. And I think there is a copy of that in the guidebook as well. But we can make that available if needed by someone to the agency.
Great. And I think in order to keep with time, I'm going to ask one kind of interesting and maybe complicated question to be our last one for the hour. And the question was, why can't real-time data be used in compliance or complaints, for instance, with pollution concerns, maybe from industry? This one came through our poll selection, and then in the chat was asked, why can't you use real-time sensor data for that application? Could you expand maybe on the different ways that sensors have pros and cons in an application like that?
Yeah, I could attempt to start to answer that, and then if anybody else wants to chime in. First of all, I think that seems like more like a fence line monitoring type approach. That if you're interested in individual polluters, and this was not a fence line project necessarily, that we targeted certain polluters and wanted to monitor their pollution. So in other words, we have these monitors all over the area, but they're more in areas where we think they're sensitive populations. For example, half of these monitors are located in schools. So that's one reason, it wasn't really designed to do that. The other reason is, at this point, these data are not accepted, say, like for litigation purposes, or accepted by government authorities as official data. And it's not to say that this won't change in the future. This is one of the reasons we're publishing a lot of this data. We did a lot of calibration and validation work. There's a possibility that these data might be accepted and included in official government resources, such as CalEnviroScreen, which is the state of California's tool to identify vulnerable populations where they include pollution data. So it might eventually be accepted into that. So I think that's down the road, but I think those two issues, that it's not, it won't hold up in court, and you would probably need to design a different a study approach if you're going to look at fence line polluters. So I don't know if anybody wants to add anything to that. And Calvin, we're going to be there's a lot of other more important questions, so I don't want people to think that we avoided questions because we didn't want to answer them or something, or they were too hard. So we're glad to answer all the questions, and it looks like, Sandra, we can put them up on the ASIC website somehow and put links and direct people to stuff so people can see their questions answered. Or Calvin? Yeah.
Yes, I think that'd be really great. Just to let everyone in the chat know, we were able to get to a few of them, but time is, of course, only limited. So I think we're very grateful not only for your presentation. Thank you all for a really enlightening project, and for sharing what you've learned, because there are a lot of communities that would like to follow your leadership. My own in North Carolina, for instance, has learned a lot from your work. So I thank you personally, as well as professionally, questions that we couldn't get to, it sounds like our presenters will be able to answer some of them kind of in writing in a follow-up. And thank you guys for that as well. Sandra, if you'd like to mention the next in our series, I'll say thank you and sign off.
Sure, thank you. So we've got our next series session that's going to happen next week, Thursday, May 14th, from 8 to 10 a.m. Pacific time. We have several of the presentations that were going to be offered at the in-person Air Sensors Conference that was supposed to happen this May, but has been postponed until 2021. So we hope you can join us for those presentations, for that 2 hours of presentations. Please do make sure that you register online on our website at asic.aqrc.ucdavis.edu/summer virtual series. Once again, thank you to all of our presenters for joining us and giving this great information. We will share additional questions on our website tomorrow, likely. I hope you guys have a great rest of your day. Thank you very much.